Do you like to play those spot the difference games? Can you see it? Well, on one side, the textures look awful. On the other side, they look good. And the difference here is how much VRAM you're running the game on. There's also huge differences in the stutters in the frame time graph, differences in the average frame rate, the 1% lows, and it's a massive difference. But let's play spot the difference again. This is the two cards I'm testing in the video. And I wouldn't blame you if you thought I was testing the same graphics card twice, because these are both the same model of PNY 5060 Ti, but if you read the fine print, one says 8 gigabytes, one says 16 gigabytes. And in this video, we are going to be investigating, is 8 gigabytes fine in 2025? I hear a lot of people say it's fine at 1080p. Well, this test seems to beg to differ, but how am I gonna go about testing this? So I set out to try to give the 8 gigabyte card a fair shake. My goal is not to go out and cherry pick games that I know have 8 gigabyte VRAM issues. My goal was actually to just test the biggest releases from 2025. So I took the 8 games that I've bought that launched in 2025 in order to test on the channel, but I didn't go out of my way to find ones that specifically have VRAM issues. This is really just most of the big game launches in 2025. And while I will test at maximum graphics settings, which is what we're looking at here, I will also reduce the graphics settings in a couple of ways. I will enable DLSS. At 1080p, I'll enable DLSS quality, but I will also test native resolution. At 1440p, I will test native resolution, and I will also test DLSS balanced. Because by lowering the internal rendering resolution, it can reduce VRAM usage, and it's fair to give that a fair shake. Also, I'm going to test out medium graphics settings because, okay, is that going to at least work on the 8 gigabytes if the highest settings don't work well? Now, the kinds of issues that you can see with the 8 gigabyte card don't lend themselves well to bar graphs. So we're going to be looking at side-by-side footage because while sometimes the frame rates are massively different, sometimes the differences are visual. So you'll spot that with side-by-side footage. Also, sometimes it's stuff that you see better on a frame time graph. Notice the smoothness difference as opposed to a bar graph of average frame rate. Although here we're seeing huge differences in the average frame rate and in the 1% lows, which are also good places to look. So we are going to look at the biggest 8 games released in 2025 at a ton of different graphic settings, maximum native, maximum upscaled, and medium settings, sometimes with upscaling as well. And we're going to figure out what is it like, how bad is it, if it's bad at all, to game on an 8 gigabyte card in 2025. So let's go ahead and take the look here. So again, this is Monster Hunter Wilds, one of the biggest releases of 2025. Sold huge copies, got tons of pushbacks. Spot the differences, guys. Look at those textures. Got big pushbacks for having terrible textures. Well, how much of that is because people didn't have enough VRAM for it? That's one question. And also just overall low performance. Now, I'm not going to say this is an optimized game, but I do want you to notice that the 16 gigabyte card here is averaging in the mid-50s. This is completely playable. The 1% lows are fine. The frame time graph is fine, but it's absolutely disastrous on the 8 gigabyte card. There's almost 2.5 times average frame rate difference and almost 3x difference in the 1% lows. And again, just the visual difference that you're seeing in the textures. By the way, don't judge screen tearing and smoothness based on the video capture. Look at the frame time graph, because I'm capturing on a 60 FPS capture card, which is out of sync with the gameplay footage, which is running at variable frame rates. The frame time graph is the best way to judge the overall smoothness. Anyway, so that's what we're looking at here. Now, I'm not using the full built-in benchmark run for Monster Hunter Wilds. I'm using a mod that cuts off the cutscenes. So we're just looking at the actual gameplay section, and then I just look at the hardest chunk of that. So I'm definitely stress testing them here. Now, kicking on DLSS quality on the maximum settings does slightly reduce, or it can slightly reduce VRAM usage, but nowhere near enough to be okay on the 8 gigabyte card. Although this further emphasizes the 16 gigabyte card here is fine. It's now averaging over 60 FPS in the most difficult part of the benchmark run. The 8 gigabyte card has improved to 42 FPS average. The 16 gigabyte card is still over 50% faster, and the 1% lows and the frame time graph is where you'll see the biggest differences, in addition to the texture differences, because we're still again, look at the creature right here. Like, you can see feathers on one and not on the other. There's a huge difference in the actual visual quality that we are seeing. Again, watch as the I don't actually play this game. Whatever this creature is called, as he turns, look at the head, right? One of them looks like, come on, lift up your head, dude. This one looks like a joke. This one actually has some detail on it. Still argue that even the 16 gigabyte card's textures could look better in this game, but it looks much better if you have enough VRAM for it. Anyway, but what if you drop down to medium settings? This is a fair test. And they do perform the same. So 8 gigabytes, at least in this game, is fine for 1080p medium settings, but not at all fine for 1080p max settings, whereas the 16 gigabyte card was fast enough to make the maximum settings completely reasonable way to play the game. Anyway, here we're seeing visuals look the same. VRAM usage appears to be under 8 gigabytes even on the 16 gigabyte card, and frame rates appear to be within margin of error, like 1 FPS difference. There's not really a difference here. Let's move up to actually DLSS quality on medium settings, though. They're getting 77 and 78 FPS averages, so these cards are capable of playing this game at reasonable frame rates. Again, at reduced settings, it's just the 16 gigabyte card doesn't need to reduce the settings. Let's go to 1440p now. As expected, after seeing the 1080p results, the 1440p results at maximum settings show the 8 gigabyte card struggling. You can see missing textures on the left-hand side, like it looks like a joke at times. The 16 gigabyte card textures look much better. The frame time graph is a stuttery mess on the 8 gigabyte card. It's only averaging 17 FPS with 10 FPS in the 1% lows. The 16 gigabyte card is averaging 42, which isn't amazing. Arguably playable, maybe not how you'd want to play it though, but huge differences here, right? Now, what if we kick on DLSS balanced and keep the rest of the graphic settings the same? Now the 16 gigabyte card, this is a completely reasonable way to play this game on the 16 gigabyte card, averaging 56 FPS in the most demanding section of this benchmark run. And the 8 gigabyte card is averaging under 30 FPS with 1% lows of 8. And there's missing textures, so despite the awful frame rates, it still looks significantly worse as well. So, bad situation on the 8 gigabyte card here, completely playable on the 16 gigabyte card. Let's go ahead and move down to medium settings at 1440p. Looks like even at 1440p, medium settings do run just fine on the 8 gigabyte card. They're averaging about 50 FPS here on both cards. Visuals look the same from everything I've noticed. Overall frame rates are a little low, so I also tested with DLSS balanced, and now both cards are averaging 68 FPS. Again, visuals look the same. So the 8 gigabyte card can reach perfectly playable settings at 1440p, but the 16 gigabyte card could enable significantly higher settings and still be completely playable. Let's go ahead and move to the newest game of 2025, Doom: The Dark Ages. At 1080p Ultra Nightmare settings, even at 1080p resolution, the 8 gigabyte card is struggling, hitting 39 FPS. I left the texture cache at its default, the game defaulted to, which was, I think, the 2 gigabyte setting, which is actually fairly low. I think there's only one notch lower. And it's still having issues here. 77 FPS versus 39, it's basically double the frame rate on the 16 gigabyte card. That being said, VRAM usage is only reporting just ever so slightly above 8 gigabytes. So if you do kick on DLSS quality, it does slightly reduce the VRAM usage, just barely under 8 gigabytes now. And now, at least for this short benchmark run in this location, the cards are performing the same at 100 FPS. Now, I will give the caveat that it's possible that in a different section of the game, you would spill slightly over this, because we are just hugging that borderline. It is incredibly close, so I would still watch out at these settings, but it didn't actually reveal any issues in this test. If we drop down to medium settings, both cards perform about the same at 86 FPS, tiny difference in the 1% lows. It is just kind of margin of error, so not much to see there. What about 1440p at Ultra Nightmare settings? Unsurprisingly, the 8 gigabyte card is struggling at 19 FPS, 15 FPS in the 1% lows. The 16 gigabyte card is almost 3 times the performance at 54 FPS. It's completely playable on a variable refresh rate display. That being said, might want to kick on DLSS balanced, and if we do that, it is not enough to keep us under 8 gigabytes. The 8 gigabyte card does significantly better. It's hitting 73 FPS now. It's pretty usable. I'm curious how bad it would fare on a longer gameplay stretch, though, if it potentially gets worse. But the 16 gigabyte card is noticeably faster at 83 FPS. That is a 14% advantage in the averages and an 18% advantage in the 1% lows. Now, I do also want to test out other settings, and I knew I did this. When I was typing this in, I forgot to change the name of this setting here. This is medium settings now. So 1440p medium settings, don't read what I wrote there. But both cards are performing about the same here. 60 FPS versus 57, so slightly better on the 16 gigabyte card. Also, the 16 gigabyte card is showing above 8 gigabytes of VRAM usage. So it's possible that, again, in other areas of the game or on a longer gameplay stretch, that those issues could compound. Now let's go ahead and drop down to DLSS balanced on the medium settings, where now we're seeing identical performance, and even the 16 gigabyte card is reporting like exactly 8 gigabytes of VRAM usage and not over that. So again, it's possible, because we're hugging that borderline so tightly, that a longer gameplay test or in a different environment potentially could spill slightly over that, but it seems like it may be under control. Now, how about Spiderman 2? This just recently has been patched a number of times to try to help with performance, among other things. Well, at max settings at 1080p, once again, the 16 gigabyte card is completely playable, averaging 55 FPS here. Sure, you might want higher frame rate, but that's right around 60 on a variable refresh rate display. You wouldn't even tell that really the difference. Whereas the 8 gigabyte card is under 30 FPS at 29 with 1% lows of 14. The average frame rate is about double on the 16 gigabyte card, and the 1% lows is almost triple. The difference between completely reasonable way to play the game and a completely terrible way to play the game. If we go to DLSS quality on the maximum settings, again, because potentially that can reduce VRAM usage a little bit, like we saw that work a little bit in Doom: The Dark Ages. Well, here we're just way beyond 8 gigabytes. It's not enough to help. So now the 16 gigabyte card is averaging 78 FPS. Very reasonable way to play this game. High frame rates, DLSS quality with the new transformer model looks good. 78 FPS versus 35. It's a massive difference between the two. One is completely playable, the other one is unplayable. Now, let's go down to medium graphic settings, and here we're within 3% performance, so it's unlikely to be a VRAM-related difference given how small that difference is, although I will say that the card with more than 8 gigabytes is allocating, it's reporting allocation of 9 gigabytes, but actual per process usage at about 6.7. So only 3% difference, so I would generally call that probably just the variance between the two cards and the two runs. Probably not VRAM related, but kind of interesting to note. Now, moving up to 1440p resolution, again at maximum settings. Here, the 16 gigabyte card is really just out of its depth, not because of VRAM, but just because this is just too hard for it to run. It's hitting 38 FPS with only 24 in the 1% lows. That being said, it's double the frame rate, literally double of the 8 gigabyte card, and the 1% lows are exactly triple at 24 versus 8. But not super realistic settings to actually use on the 16 gigabyte card. So let's jump ahead to DLSS balanced. Hey, now max settings DLSS balanced let me go back a bit so we can see more of the run. Maximum settings on the 16 gigabyte card with DLSS balanced. 1440p output with the newer DLSS models looks pretty good. 66 FPS average, completely playable. The 8 gigabyte card is only hitting 25 FPS average and 11 in the 1% lows. 1% lows are over 4 times as high on the 16 gigabyte card, and the average FPS is about 2.6 times the frame rate. Again, the difference between completely playable, reasonable way to use the game, and completely broken on the 8 gigabyte card. Let's go ahead and take a look at medium settings, though. Now, at medium settings, we're seeing similar to what we saw at 1080p, about a 3% performance difference. The 16 gigabyte card reports allocation over 8 gigabytes, but not actual per process usage over 8 gigabytes, and the performance difference is rather small. So potentially there's a tiny bit of VRAM difference affecting the result, but unlikely. But, you know, it could be beneficial to have more allocated and be helping out performance a tiny, tiny bit. Anyway, let's go ahead and test some other stuff like DLSS quality at medium settings. Now both cards are over 120 FPS. We're seeing the same thing with the allocation and per process usage I mentioned before. But again, the 8 gigabyte card can be used completely fine to play this game, but you just have to reduce the settings significantly compared to max. Now, how about Assassin's Creed Shadows? Another big game with its own, unique engine. And once again, even at 1080p resolution, if you try to play the game at maximum settings, the 8GB card doesn't have enough VRAM. The 16GB card reports over 8GB of usage and about 10GB or more of allocation, and it's running 16% faster in the averages and 24% better in the 1% lows. That being said, the overall frame rates for even the 16GB card here, I would say, are not particularly usable. We're only hitting 37 FPS, so probably not the way you'd play the game on that card either. Let's go ahead and kick on DLSS quality, though. This gets the 16GB card up to 44 FPS, which, if you're playing this on a controller, might be reasonable on a variable refresh rate display. I'd personally probably still chase higher frame rates. The 8GB card is slower at 38. There's a 17% advantage for the 16GB card in the averages and 16% in the 1% lows. Again, you could try to spot differences. I didn't see anything jumping out at me. There's nothing as wildly different as what we saw with Monster Hunter Wilds, for example, but perhaps I missed something. Anyway, let's go ahead and reduce to medium settings. Medium settings, 8GB does play just fine. Both cards are averaging exactly the same at 75 FPS, so both cards are doing okay here. I think realistically, the 16GB card could probably have just turned down a few key settings and got perfectly reasonable performance at near maximum settings, whereas the 8GB card is going to have to take these more dramatic hits. But I didn't take the time to try to optimize for 8GB versus 16. That's really beyond the scope of video with testing this many games in it. At 1440p max settings, the 16GB card is 20% faster in the averages and 25% faster in the 1% lows, although is not particularly usable here, only averaging 30 FPS with 1% lows at 25. If you kick on DLSS balanced, the 16GB card is more playable. If you want like a 40 FPS mode, it averages 42. It's 24% faster than the 8GB card, 30% faster in the 1% lows. Realistically, I think the 16GB card could start with these settings and then just turn a couple key ones down to reach closer to 60 FPS, whereas the 8GB card is going to take a bigger hit. Anyway, I did test out medium settings at 1440p, and the 8GB card still seems to be fine here. 1 FPS difference between the two GPUs, likely just run-to-run variants and silicon lottery variants, etc. So there's that, and again, both are averaging right around 60 FPS, and if you kick on DLSS balanced, they're actually both averaging 83 FPS. So again, the 8GB card can get a good 1440p experience here, but again, it's going to have to take a serious hit to the graphics settings in order to get there. Now, let's go ahead and test out Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. Arguably one of the most, can be one of the most optimized games we've seen of the year. Nice frame time graphs, etc., but it does offer as its maximum settings an experimental setting, which it does warn you is really designed for future hardware, and this is very difficult for both GPUs. It is going over 8GB of VRAM, and that's causing the 16GB card to be about 3.5 times the performance and over 4 times the 1% lows. But even the 16GB card here is not performing super well. It's only hitting about 41 FPS. Now, if we kick on DLSS quality, both cards do better. And actually, the 8GB card seems to be working now. We can see that the VRAM usage and allocation on the 16GB card is staying like right at that 8GB mark. I'm not noticing any obvious texture differences or things like that here. Perhaps I'm missing something, but it does appear to be running okay now on the 8GB card, but neither GPU is performing super high here, so probably not the settings you'd want to use. Now, as is my methodology for this video, I'm also testing out medium settings, and here's where when people say this game is optimized, like, both cards here are getting a high refresh rate experience, and the game still looks very good. You can see very realistic foliage. I think that's one of the places where the game really excels. It has some other graphic full features that aren't quite as good, but averaging around 140 FPS on both GPUs. Actually, the 8GB card technically slightly ahead, but again, there's some run-to-run variance, and the two GPUs aren't exactly the same physical card, despite being as identical as possible. Now, at 1440p experimental, again, it's no surprise that the 8GB card is crushed at a 9 FPS average and 6 in the 1% lows. It's a slideshow. The 16GB card isn't running it particularly well, but 34 FPS is certainly a heck of a lot better than 9. But let's go ahead and kick on DLSS Balanced. That is not enough to save the 8GB card at 1440p, and it still is hitting 9 FPS and 6 in the 1% lows, whereas the 16GB card is now averaging 40 FPS, which again, if it's a slow-paced game, maybe some people would use these settings. I'd definitely turn some things down though, personally. But huge difference between the two cards for sure. Now, I also test out medium settings, and you can see here that both GPUs do very well at medium settings, and the foliage still looks quite nice. Here we're seeing 96 versus 92, so 4% difference, actually once again in the 8GB card's favor. So it seems like when we're within the 8GB VRAM buffer, this game seems to slightly prefer my 8GB card, not sure exactly why. They seem to be clocking the same, both at 2812. I don't know, guys. Anyway, whatever. Let's go ahead and move on to a less optimized RPG release of 2025. How about Oblivion Remastered? 1080p max settings, so ultra settings with the hardware accelerated Lumen from Unreal Engine 5 set to its ultra settings. The 16GB card is 22% faster than the averages, but 61% better in the 1% lows. And both have a spiky frame time graph because this game just stutters on every system in GPU and CPU. But it's more stuttery on the 8GB card. And we are showing allocation beyond 8GB on the card that has it. Anyway, there's that. Not amazing frame rates even on the 16GB card though. So what if we go ahead and kick on DLSS quality? Well, with the newer DLSS models, that can be a reasonable thing to do. And we're now hitting 62 FPS average on the 16GB card. Still a few stutters here and there from the just game itself that you can't really avoid, but a reasonable way to play the game at around 60 FPS. The 8GB card is only hitting 33. So 88% advantage for the 16GB card, more than double in the 1% lows. It's a very noticeable difference. What if we went down to medium settings and turned off the hardware Lumen and went to software Lumen at its lowest settings? Now both GPUs are doing fine in the averages at 93 versus 91, but interestingly, the 1% lows are noticeably better on the 16GB card at 58 versus 41. Again, both get their share of stutters due to the game, but there do seem to be more frequent stutters on the 8GB card, which is interesting. Now, again, with a game this stuttery, that could just be run-to-run variance, but I noticed that consistently in all of my testing. So there is that. Now, at 1440p max settings, again, not a surprise, the 8GB card is absolutely crushed, averaging 13 FPS and 7 in the 1% lows. 16GB card, I guess, could be your 30 FPS mode. Probably not the way you'd want to play the game, though. 33 FPS versus 13 is a lot better, relatively, but still probably not how you want to play. Let's go ahead and kick on DLSS Balanced. Well, now, on a variable refresh rate display, the 16GB card is perfectly reasonable, averaging 53 FPS on a VRR display that is not that noticeably different than a 60 FPS experience. You might play the game at max settings with DLSS Balanced. The 8GB card, though, is absolutely crushed at 25 FPS average and 16 in the 1% lows. If we go down to medium settings, the averages are now about the same, but I'm once again noticing, and I don't think it's a coincidence, that the 8GB card gets stutters much more severely and much more frequently than the 16GB card. The 1% lows are 46 versus 27, and the frame time graph looks a bit smoother on the 16GB card. So 70% difference in the 1% lows into the advantage of the 16GB card. So again, noticeable difference there. What if we kick on DLSS Balanced on these medium settings with the software Lumen at low? Well, now both GPUs average 106 FPS, although once again, I'm actually noticing a measurable difference in the 1% lows in the advantage of the 16GB card at 67 versus 57. Again, that's an 18% lead, and again, this game is stuttering on both because this game just stutters, especially when you transition between, what do they call them, cells in the underlying engine. Because this is a weird game where it's like, it's an Unreal Engine 5 wrapper on top of the original Oblivion code. So anyway, it's a weird, weird game situation. It stutters on everything. But now let's switch to actually my favorite RPG of the year, Clair Obscur Expedition 33. I absolutely loved this game, and I'm just going to shamelessly plug it. This game was awesome. Highly recommend it. Really, really enjoyed it. Anyway, how's it doing on the 8GB card? Well, if you just look at the averages, it seems fine. 1 FPS difference. If you look at the 1% lows, there's a 38% advantage to the 16GB card at 44 versus 32. You're seeing a flat frame time graph now, but if you had seen it back at the very start of the run, that's where it had tipped, I think, right over that 8GB VRAM barrier, and it got stuttery. And that's the way some games are, is they get more stuttery in certain locations as the VRAM usage changes depending on what's going on screen. Now, if I go ahead and kick on DLSS quality, now the GPUs do seem to both be under 8GB of VRAM, and I'm not seeing any noticeably different performance. 3% advantage to the 16GB card, but again, there can be some slight run-to-run variance. The two cards, again, are not physically the same GPU. Yeah, a couple of percent difference I wouldn't read too much into here. No, medium settings, once again, pretty much identically performant, 83 FPS versus 84. Both of them give you a good experience. So 8GB cards can play this game just fine at medium settings. At epic settings, there was a bit of an issue. It seems like it's going to be borderline depending on where you're at in the game. At 1440p epic settings, it's a much more obvious difference. Look at the frame time graphs right now. Okay, it's a disaster on the 8GB card. The 16GB card has a few little hitches here and there. It is an Unreal Engine 5 game, although I will say this game seems to be better optimized than most Unreal Engine 5 games. But a 16% advantage in the averages for the 16GB card, a 7.5 times performance in the 1% lows, though, at 30 versus 4. That being said, it's still not a great frame rate for the 16GB card. So, how about we kick on DLSS balanced? Well, now the 16GB card is averaging 66, but the 8GB is hitting 65, and the 1% lows are also matched pretty much at 56 and 55. So, good experience on both now at epic settings with DLSS balanced, although, again, the 16GB card is reporting allocation just barely under 8GB, and this is just one section of the game, and it's a very short snippet, so it's close enough to the borderline that I wouldn't be confident saying that you wouldn't see issues on a longer playthrough in other areas of the game. I can't confirm one way or the other. This seems like it might be somewhat borderline. What if we dropped to medium settings? Well, now we're definitely seeing good. Both are averaging 59 FPS at native 1440p medium, and if you kick on DLSS balance, they're both averaging 99. So again, the 8GB card can do just fine in this game, especially if you reduce some settings and or used upscaling. Let's go ahead and take a look at one more game, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I chose to test kind of a densely populated town environment. And here I'm not seeing a measurable difference in the performance, and I didn't notice anything difference in the spot the difference game. Maybe you guys will, because the 16GB card is reporting allocation well above 8GB. But the 8GB card is seeming to do okay. So this is one of the ones where I wonder if there's going to be some texture swapping differences that are just hard for me to spot. Maybe you guys can spot it. But I can't confirm any differences that I've actually been able to measure or spot myself. So, good result for the 8GB card. At 1440p high settings, we are seeing a slightly measurable difference here for the advantage of the 16GB card now, though. It's 72 versus 67, 7% advantage in the averages, 19% better in the 1% lows at 38 versus 32. Pretty sure this is a kind of a custom Unreal Engine 4 branch that they're using to make this game. Just by the way, as a side note, and the frame time graph looks really ugly. Anyway, but whatever, that's beside the point. So it looks like at 1080p, I didn't notice 8GB issues, but it was really, really borderline. I'm not sure if other areas might not have spotted it or a longer play session. 1440p did have some issues, and kicking on DLSS quality does not completely solve those issues. We're still seeing a noticeable advantage, although not massive, for the 16GB card at 90 versus 85. 6% lead in the averages, 11% lead in the 1% lows. But once again, this type of testing is a short test of one environment. It's very possible that other environments could be more demanding, or just a longer playthrough continues to fill the VRAM buffer. So this is a game where I'm going to say it's not seeming like too dramatic of an issue, but it's right on that borderline where I wouldn't give a heartfelt, yeah, like 8 gigabytes max settings is totally gonna be absolutely fine here. We're seeing allocation well above 8 gigabytes reported on the 16 gigabyte card. So I did also try medium settings at 1440p since we were seeing some issues with the 8 gigabyte card that were measurable. And now I'm actually seeing slight differences in performance, but it's actually slight advantage 8 gigabyte card, not noticeably so. So again, there's some run-to-run variance, etc., like I've mentioned before. Although the 16 gigabyte card is once again reporting allocation above 8 gigabytes. So I am still concerned that on a longer play session with other environments, etc., that maybe there could be more of an issue on the 8 gigabyte cards that is just not manifesting under this testing scenario. Anyway, that is all of the tests that I ran, and that is a lot of tests. Again, final thoughts. Again, I don't want to go into the bar graphs because, like I said, some of the issues here are best represented on frame time graphs. They're best represented with 1% lows. They're best represented with spotting visual differences, like we see here in Monster Hunter Wilds on the missing textures on the 8 gigabyte card, all of that. But how about we summarize what we just saw? So I think one good way of putting it is, out of the 8 new releases of 2025 that I tested here, I may have missed some 2025 releases, but these are the 8 I bought and noticed and tested on the channel. Out of these 8, which were not specifically selected specifically to test VRAM issues, I selected them just because they are major releases of the year 2025. And in every single one of them, 1440p caused problems at max settings, and often still caused problems with upscaling at 1440p, and then often you had to reduce to the medium settings and or upscaling to get the VRAM under control at 1440p. At 1080p, I would say that 7 of the 8 games showed noticeable issues at 1080p max settings on the 8 gigabyte card. The only game that didn't noticeably present issues on my test run at max settings at 1080p was Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which is using an old engine with Unreal Engine 4. But again, as the run went on, the card with more VRAM began to allocate more. And it's possible, like I said, that under longer test session, that issues could have manifested that just didn't pick up here. So I can confirm issues at 1080p max settings in 7 of the 8 biggest releases of 2025 that I've bought for the channel. And one of them, I'm not a heartfelt, there's no issues. It's just, it didn't actually manifest any that I noticed specifically in the short test run that I did. That's not a good look for 8 gigabyte cards at 1080p in 2025. That being said, using DLSS solved the issue on a couple of the games, like the Ultra Nightmare settings in Doom the Dark Ages, but at least reducing to medium settings solved the issues in most of the games, although I did, like I said, still see in Oblivion, where even at the medium settings, it seemed to be the case that the 8 gigabyte cards stuttered more. Now, this game is just incredibly stuttery, so maybe the 8 gigabyte card was just getting less lucky with these stutters, but every single medium setting test that I did showed that behavior. So there's that. Okay, so my overall conclusion is that if you already have an 8 gigabyte graphics card in 2025 that maybe you bought 4 years ago or something like that, then it's not a complete disaster, especially at 1080p. You can turn most games down to medium settings. Honestly, there's probably some custom settings that you could find that are best optimized for 1080p 8 gigabyte cards, and you can make it work. But every game pretty much that I tested here, except for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which is a maybe, showed issues at max settings. Like 8 gigabyte cards just are no longer okay to just play 1080p without worrying about spilling over VRAM. You will have to customize your graphics settings in almost every game, big game released in 2025, even at 1080p on an 8 gigabyte card. And that's a problem. It's especially a problem because it looks like AMD is about to do the same thing. With the 9060 XT having both an 8 and 16 gigabyte model, I'm expecting the exact same kind of issue that we're seeing here, where we have 2 cards that, to the unwary consumer, look like they're the same thing, but one of them has massive issues while the other does not. And NVIDIA is also releasing a 5060 with 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and they're pulling the shadiest stuff they have ever done in the review program for this, where only certain review outlets who promise to publish previews that are under specific NVIDIA-controlled test conditions can have a review driver. So in addition to their preview content coming out early, they'll be the only ones with day one reviews. And that's really shady, and this tells me that this is the behavior of a company that knows that there are very easy to find problems with their product and yet are releasing it anyway. I'm disappointed that AMD seems to be following the same route, although we haven't seen pricing for this card yet, because let's talk about that. You know, if the 5060 is $299, I don't like that, but it's certainly less disgusting than the card I was testing in this video, which is the 5060 Ti, which is significantly more expensive. We have yet to see what the 9060 XTs will cost for both variants. Hoping the 8GB card is incredibly cheap to justify the 8GB, but I don't think they save enough on the actual manufacturing costs to actually have it cost that much less than the 16GB version. How's this playing out right now with the 5060 Ti's? Well, if I wanted to buy a 5060 Ti, I could buy one for $420 in the United States. That's the lowest price in stock. It's above MSRP, so you'd be spending over $400. And notice, this is an 8GB model. I gotta scroll down a ways if I'm sorting prices low to high, which is how I think most people shop on these kinds of sites, before you find a 16GB model. And that's $473. So a lot of unwary people, and again, it is on them. They should know the difference. They need to seek out reviews like this one where I'm talking about this stuff. But a lot of people might not. Or you're buying a pre-built system. You know there's a 5060 Ti in it. Maybe it doesn't even say if it's the 8 or 16GB version. That's one of my biggest issues with all of this. The point is, it's over $400 for an 8GB card that's giving us all of these issues. Now, the price difference as a percentage is less than 13%. So if you're looking at that, look at these side-by-sides. Look at all of the issues you're getting, even if you're planning on playing at 1080p in 2025, and it is not worth saving the 13% on that 8GB version of the card. It's just not. And honestly, I have a feeling the resale value of the card will pay for itself if you get the 16GB model, compared to what you'll be able to resell the 8GB card for, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago whenever you go ahead and get rid of it. And that's the last thing I want to leave you with here. This is 2025 releases, which are the best way to measure what's going to be coming in the future. And again, huge issues in almost every single game at 1080p and issues in all of them at 1440p. But it will continue to get worse, especially as we move into the next console generation, which while we don't know exactly when that will be, it's expected within the next 2 or 3 years, most likely. And a next console generation will mean new game development targets, because consoles are generally the target platforms, and they will likely have more VRAM available than current consoles do. And even current consoles, so even if you're thinking cross-platform games, already have access to more than 8GB of VRAM. Honestly, I shudder to think what the situation would be like if the Series S didn't exist, because game developers do at least have to offer some sort of RAM-limited situation on that console. So at least some development time besides thinking about PC users is dedicated to that. As we move into the next console generation, I think things are going to get dramatically worse. Anyway, this is where we're at in 2025. So I think the adage that 1080p, 8GB is fine for 1080p is just dead wrong in the new releases. Can you still make it work? Absolutely. Should you buy a brand new 8GB card in 2025? Absolutely not. And if you're watching this on the day I release it, which is probably right around when the 5060 is coming available, but I won't have a review at launch. I will test it in the same suite of games, by the way, once I buy once I get one and get reviewed, get driver access with the public. Anyway, but the point is, it's an 8GB card. You're going to be running into these issues already. It's going to get worse. I don't recommend it. I hope all of you, though, have an excellent day.